Escape Pod, Episode 665. Flashback Friday. The Man Who Lost the Sea by Theodore Sturgeon.
Welcome to Flashback Fridays, which this week features episode 500, The Man Who Lost the Sea by Theodore Sturgeon, and read by Anson Mount. Sturgeon is one of those authors who needs very little introduction, but perhaps a little bit of context. He was a critic as well as a writer. The Internet Speculative Fiction database credits him with about 400 reviews and more than 200 stories. His most famous work may be the science fiction novel More Than Human from 1953, but he was also one of those authors who was passionately interested not only in science fiction, but in the shape it was, why, and how that shape could conceivably be hammered into something else. He's an interesting guy, and very much worthy of further investigation. As is our narrator this week, who is probably a lot more familiar to you, especially those of you who have CBS All Access, than he was the last time this story ran. Anson Mount is a consummate actor. He's a man who has consistently been the best thing in anything I've seen him in, and the most recent thing I've seen him in is Star Trek Discovery, as Captain Christopher Pike, where if you look very closely, you can see just about how hard he's working to hold the grin in all the time. Born in White Bluff, Tennessee, he holds a Master of Fine Arts in acting from Columbia, where he now serves as an associate adjunct professor. He's a proud humanitarian, and in 2012, he completed a 200-mile relay to help raise funds for Team Rubicon in support of the victims of Hurricane Sandy, and he currently resides in New York. In addition to Discovery, Anson is best known for his recent work on shows like The Inhumans. He was Cullen Bohannon on Hell on Wheels, and he starred opposite Isla Fisher in the horror thriller Visions. However, if there is one piece of Anson's work I would recommend unreservedly to you, aside from all the other stuff I'd recommend, it's his podcast, The Well. Co-hosted with Brandon Edgens, it brings you stories and interviews about creative inspiration, often going very, very deep on context and reasoning, with some truly extraordinary guests. Anson, and you'll know this if you heard the Pseudopod episode he guest hosted, is a spectacularly good host, and he and Brannon talk about these issues which are simultaneously intensely personal and universal in a way which is intimate and friendly and welcoming and inspirational. It's an incredible show, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. But I've talked far too long, so now both Mr. Sturgeon and Anson have a story for you. Because, if you can forgive me the indulgence of mashing up my two taglines, it's story time.
Say you're a kid, and one dark night you're running along the cold sand with this helicopter in your hand, saying very fast, "Witch, witch, 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 witch." You pass the sick man, and he wants you to shove off with that thing. Maybe he thinks you're too old to play with toys. So you squat next to him in the sand and tell him it isn't a toy. It's a model. You tell him, look here. Here's something most people don't know about helicopters. You take the blade of the rotor in your fingers and show him how it can move in the hub, up and down a little, back and forth a little, and twist a little to change pitch. You start to tell him how this flexibility does away with the gyroscopic effect, but he won't listen. He doesn't want to think about flying, about helicopters, or about you. And he most especially does not want explanations about anything by anybody. Not now. Now, he wants to think about the sea. So you go away. The sick man is buried in the cold sand with only his head and his left arm showing. He is dressed in a pressure suit and looks like a man from Mars. Built into his left sleeve is a combination timepiece and pressure gauge. The gauge with a luminous blue indicator which makes no sense. The clock hand's luminous red. He can hear the pounding of surf and the soft, swift pulse of his pumps. One time long ago, when he was swimming, he went too deep and stayed down too long and came up too fast. And when he came to, it was like this. They said, "Don't move, boy. You've got the bends. Don't even try to move. He had tried anyway. It hurt. So now, this time, he lies in the sand without moving, without trying. His head isn't working right, but he knows clearly that it isn't working right, which is a strange thing that happens to people in shock sometimes. Say you were that kid. You could say how it was, because once you woke up lying in the gym office in high school and asked what had happened. They explained how you tried something on the parallel bars and fell on your head. You understood exactly, though you couldn't remember falling. Then a minute later you asked again what had happened, and they told you. You understood it. And a minute later, 41 times they told you. And you understood. It was just that no matter how many times they pushed it into your head, it wouldn't stick there. But all the while you knew that your head would start working again in time. And in time, it did. Of course, if you were that kid, always explaining things to people and to yourself, you wouldn't want to bother the sick man with it now. Look what you've done already, making him send you away with that angry shrug of the mind, which, with the eyes, are the only things which will move just now. The motionless effort costs him a wave of nausea. He has felt seasick before, but he has never been seasick. And the formula for that is to keep your eyes on the horizon and stay busy. Now. Then he better get busy now. For there's one place especially not to be seasick in, and that's locked up in a pressure suit. Now! So he busies himself as best he can with the seascape, landscape, sky. He lies on the high ground, his head propped on a vertical wall of black rock. There is another such outcrop before him, whip-topped with white sand and with smooth, flat sand. Beyond and down is valley, salt flat, estuary. He cannot yet be sure. He is sure of the line of footprints, which begin behind him, pass to his left, disappear in the outcrop shadows, and reappear beyond to vanish at last into the shadows of the valley. Stretched across the sky is old morning cloth with starlight burning holes in it, and between the holes the black is absolute. Wintertime, mountaintop, sky black. Far off on the horizon within himself he sees the swell and crest of approaching nausea. He counters with an undertow of weakness which meets and rounds and settles the wave before it can break. Get busier. Now. Burst in on him then with the X-15 model. That'll get him. Hey, how about this for a gimmick? Get too high for the thin air to give you any control? You have these little jets on the wingtips, see? On the sides of the empennage. Bank, roll, yaw, whatever. With squirts of compressed air. But the sick man curls his sick lip. Oh, get, will you? That has nothing to do with the sea. So you get. Out and out the sick man forces his view, etching all he sees with a meticulous intensity, as if it might be his charge one day to duplicate all this. To his left is only starlit sea, windless. In front of him across the valley, rounded hills with dim white epaulets of light. To his right, the jutting corner of the black wall against which his helmet rests. He thinks the distant mountings of nausea becalmed, but he will not look yet. So he scans the sky, black and bright, calling Sirius, calling Pleiades, Polaris, Ursa Minor, calling that. Why, it moves. Watch it. Yes, it moves. It is a fleck of light, seeming to be wrinkled, fissured, rather like a chip of boiled cauliflower in the sky. Of course, he knows better than to trust his own eyes just now. But that movement! As a child, he had stood on cold sand in a frosty Cape Cod evening, watching Sputnik's steady spark rise out of the haze, madly, dawning a little north of west. And after that, he had sleeplessly wound special coils for his receiver, risked his life restringing high antennas, all for the brief capture of an unreadable tweedledeep-tweedle in his earphones from Vanguard, Explorer, Lunik, Discoverer, Mercury. He knew them all. Well, some people collect match covers, stamps, and he knew especially that unmistakable, steady sliding in the sky. This moving fleck was a satellite, and in a moment motionless, uninstrumented but for his chronometer and his part brain, he will know which one. He is grateful beyond expression. Without that sliding chip of light, there were only those footprints, those wandering footprints, to tell a man he was not alone in the world. Say you're a kid, eager and challengeable, and more than a little bright. You might in a day or so work out a way to measure the period of a satellite with nothing but a timepiece and a brain. You might eventually see that the shadow in the rocks ahead had been there from the first only because of the light from the rising satellite. Now, if you check the time exactly at the moment when the shadow on the sand is equal to the height of the outcrop, and time it again when the light is at the zenith and the shadow gone, you will multiply this number of minutes by 8. Think why now? Horizon to zenith is 1/4 of the orbit, give or take a little, and halfway up the sky is half that quarter, and you will then know this satellite's period. You know all the periods, 92 minutes, 2.5 hours. With that and the appearance of this bird, you'll find out which one it is. But if you were that kid, eager or resourceful or whatever, you wouldn't jabber about it to the sick man. Not only does he not want to be bothered with you, he's thought of all that long since and is even now watching the shadows for that triangular split second of measurement. Now, his eyes drop to the face of his chronometer. 0400. Near as, makes no never mind. He has minutes to wait now. 10, 30, 23. While this baby moon eats up its slice of shadow pie. And that's too bad. The waiting. For though the inner sea is calm, there are currents below. Shadows that shift and swim. Be busy. Be busy. He must not swim near that great invisible amoeba, whatever happens. Its first cold pseudopod is even now reaching for the vitals. Being a knowledgeable young fellow, not quite a kid anymore, wanting to help the sick man too, you want to tell him everything you know about that cold in the gut, that reaching, invisible, surrounding, implacable amoeba. You know all about it. Listen, you want to tell him, don't let that touch of cold bother you. Just know what it is. That's all. Know what it is that is touching your gut. You want to tell him, listen, this is how you met the monster and dissected it. Listen, you were skin diving in the Grenadines, 100 tropical shoalwater islands. You had a new blue snorkel mask, the kind with faceplate and breathing tube all in one, and new blue flippers on your feet, and a new blue spear gun. All this new because you'd only begun, you see. You were a beginner, aghast with pleasure at your easy intrusion into this underwater otherworld. You'd been out in a boat. You were coming back. You'd just reached the mouth of the little bay. You'd taken the notion to swim the rest of the way. You'd said as much to the boys and slipped into the warm, silky water. You brought your gun. Not far to go at all, but then beginners find wet distances deceiving. For the first 5 minutes or so, it was only delightful. The sun hot on your back and the water so warm it seemed not to have any temperature at all. And you were flying. With your face under the water, your mask was not so much attached as part of you. Your wide blue flippers trot away yards. Your gun rode all but weightless in your hand, the taut rubber sling making an occasional hum as your passage plucked it in the sunlit green. In your ears crooned the breathy monotone of the snorkel tube, and through the invisible disk of plate glass, you saw wonders. The bay was shallow, 10, 12 feet or so, and sandy with great growths of brain, bone, and fire coral, intricate waving sea fans and fish, such fish, scarlet and green and aching azure, gold and rose and slate-colored studded with sparks of enamel blue, pink and peach and silver. And that thing got into you, that monster. There were enemies in this other world. The sand-colored spotted sea snake with his big ugly head and turned-down mouth, who would not retreat but lay watching the intruder pass. And the mottled moray with jaws like bolt cutters. And somewhere around, certainly, the barracuda with his undershot face and teeth turned inward so that he must take away whatever he might strike. There were urchins, the plump white sea egg with its thick fur of sharp quills, and the black ones with the long, slender spines that would break off in unwary flesh and fester there for weeks, and filefish and stonefish with their poisoned barbs and lethal meat, and the stingray, who could drive his spike through a leg bone. Yet these were not monsters, and could not matter to you, the invader churning along above them all. For you were above them in so many ways, armed, rational, comforted by the close shore. Ahead, the beach, the rocks on each side, and by the presence of the boat not too far behind. Yet you were attacked. At first it was uneasiness, not pressing but pervasive, a contact quite as intimate as that of the sea. You were sheathed in it, and also there was the touch, the cold, inward contact. Aware of it at last, you laughed. For Pete's sake, what's there to be scared of? The monster. The amoeba. You raised your head and looked back in air. The boat had edged into the cliff at the right. Someone was giving a last poke around for a lobster. You waved at the boat. It was your gun, you waved. And emerging from the water, it gained its latent ounces so that you sank a bit. And as if you had no snorkel on, you tipped your head back to get a breath. But tipping your head back plunged the end of the tube under the water. The valve closed. You drew in a hard lungful of nothing at all. You dropped your face under. Up came the tube. You got your air, and along with it a bullet of seawater which struck you somewhere inside the throat. You coughed it out and floundered, sobbing as you sucked in air, inflating your chest until it hurt, and the air you got seemed no good at all, a worthless, devitalized, inert gas. You clenched your teeth and headed for the beach, kicking strongly and knowing it was the right thing to do, and then below and to the right you saw a great bulk, mounding up out of the sand floor of the sea. You knew it was only the reef, rocks, and coral and weed, but the sight of it made you scream. You didn't care what you knew. You turned hard left to avoid it, fought by as if it would reach for you, and you couldn't get air, for all the unobstructed hooting of your snorkel tube. You couldn't bear the mask suddenly, not for another second, so you shoved it upward clear of your mouth and rolled over, floating on your back and opening your mouth to the sky, and breathing with a quacking noise. It was then and there that the monster well and truly engulfed you, mantling you round and about within itself, formless, borderless, the illimitable amoeba. The beach mere yards away, and the rocky arms of the bay, and the not-too-distant boat. These you could identify but no longer distinguish, for they were all one and the same thing. The thing called unreachable. You fought that way for a time on your back, dangling the gun under and behind you and straining to get enough warm sun-stained air into your chest. And in time, some particles of sanity began to swirl in the roil of your mind, and to dissolve and tint it. The air pumping in and out of your square-grinned, frightened mouth began to be meaningful at last, and the monster relaxed away from you. You took stock, saw surf, beach, a leaning tree. You felt the new send of your body as the rollers humped to become breakers. Only a dozen firm kicks brought you to where you could roll over and double up. Your shin struck coral with a lovely agony, and you stood in foam and waded ashore. You gained the wet sand, hard sand, and ultimately, with 2 more paces powered by bravado, you crossed high water mark and lay in the dry sand, unable to move. You lay in the sand, and before you were able to move or think, you were able to feel a triumph because you were alive and knew that much without thinking at all. When you were able to think, your first thought was of the gun, and the first move you were able to make was to let go at last of the thing. You had nearly died because you had not let it go before. Without it, you would not have been burdened, and you would not have panicked. You had, you began to understand, kept it because someone else would have had to retrieve it, easily enough, and you could not have stood the laughter. You had almost died because they might laugh at you. This was the beginning of the dissection, analysis, study of the monster. It began then. It had never finished. Some of what you had learned from it was merely important. Some of the rest, vital. You had learned, for example, never to swim farther with a snorkel than you could swim back without one. You learned never to burden yourself with the unnecessary in an emergency. Even a hand or a foot might be as expendable as a gun. Pride was expendable. Dignity was. You learned never to dive alone, even if they laugh at you. Even if you have to shoot a fish yourself and say afterward, "We shot it." Most of all, you learned that fear has many fingers, and one of them, a simple one, made of too great a concentration of carbon dioxide in your blood, as from too rapid breathing in and out of the same tube, is not really fear at all, but feels like fear, and can turn into panic and kill you. Listen, you want to say, listen, there isn't anything wrong with such an experience, or with all the study it leads to, because a man who can learn enough from it could become fit enough, cautious enough, foresighted, unafraid, modest, teachable enough to be chosen, to be qualified for. You lose the thought, or turn it away, because the sick man feels that cold touch deep inside. Feels it right now. Feels it beyond ignoring. Above and beyond anything that you, with all your experience and certainty, could explain to him, even if he would listen, which he won't. Make him, then. Tell him the cold touch is some simple, explainable thing like anoxia, like gladness even. Some triumph that he will be able to appreciate when his head is working right again. Triumph? Here he's alive after whatever it is, and that doesn't seem to be triumph enough, though it was in the Grenadines. And that other time when he got the bends, saved his own life, saved 2 other lives. Now, somehow, it's not the same. There seems to be a reason why just being alive afterward isn't a triumph. Why not a triumph? Because not 12, not 20, not even 30 minutes is taking the satellite to complete its 1/8 of an orbit. 50 minutes are gone, and still there's a slice of shadow yonder. It is this which is placing the cold finger upon his heart. And he doesn't know why. He doesn't know why. He will not know why. He is afraid. He shall when his head is working again. Oh, where's the kid? Where is any way to busy the mind? Apply it to something, anything else but the watch hand which outruns the moon. Here, kid, come over here. What you got there? If you were the kid, then you'd forgive everything and hunker down with your new model, not a toy, not a helicopter, or a rocket plane, but the big one. The one that looks like an overgrown cartridge. It's so big, even as a model, that even an angry, sick man wouldn't call it a toy. A giant cartridge. But watch. The lower 4/5 is alpha, all muscle. Over 1,000,000 pounds thrust. Snap it off, throw it away. Half the rest is beta, all brains. It puts you on your way. Snap it off, throw it away. And now, at the polished fraction which is left, touch a control somewhere and see. See? It has wings. Wide, triangular wings. This is Gamma, the one with wings. And on its back is a small sausage. It is a moth with a sausage on its back. The sausage, click, it comes free, is Delta. Delta is the last, the smallest. Delta is the way home. What will they think of next? Quite a toy, quite a toy. Beat it, kid. The satellite is almost overhead, the sliver of shadow going, almost gone and gone. Check. 0459. 59 minutes? Give or take a few? Times 8, 472 is 7 hours, 52 minutes? 7 hours, 52 minutes? Why, there isn't a satellite round Earth with a period like that. In all the solar system, there's only... The cold finger turns fierce, implacable. The east is paling, and the sick man turns to it, wanting the light, the sun, an end to questions whose answers couldn't be looked upon. The sea stretches endlessly out of the growing light, and endlessly somewhere out of sight, the surf roars. The paling east bleaches the sandy hilltops and throws the line of footprints into aching relief. That would be the buddy, the sick man knows, gone for help. He cannot at the moment recall who the buddy is, but in time he will, and meanwhile the footprints make him less alone. The sun's upper rim thrusts itself above the horizon with a flash of green instantly gone. There is no dawn, just the green flash, and then a clear white blast of unequivocal sunup. The sea could not be wider, more still, if it were frozen and snow-blanketed. In the west, stars still blaze, and overhead the crinkled satellite is scarcely abashed by the growing light. A formless jumble in the valley below begins to resolve itself into a sort of tent city or installation of some kind, with tube-like and sail-like buildings. This would have meaning for the sick man if his head were working right. Soon it would. Well. Oh. The sea out on the horizon just under the rising sun is behaving strangely, for in that place where properly belongs a pool of unbearable brightness, there is instead a notch of brown. It is as if the white fire of the sun is drinking dry the sea, for look! The notch becomes a bow, and the bow a crescent, racing ahead of the sunlight. White sea ahead of it, and behind it a cocoa dry stain spreading across and down toward where he watches. Beside the finger of fear which lies on him, another finger places itself, and another, making ready for that clutch, that grip, that ultimate insane squeeze of panic. Yet beyond that again, past the squeeze when it comes, to be savored if the squeeze is only fear and not panic, lies triumph. Triumph and a glory. It is perhaps this which constitutes his whole battle. To fit himself, prepare himself to bear the utmost that fear could do. For if he can do that, there is a triumph on the other side. But not yet. Please. Not yet a while. Something flies, or flew, or will fly, he is a little confused on this point, toward him, from the far right where the stars still shine. It is not a bird, and it is unlike any aircraft on Earth, for the aerodynamics are wrong. Wings so wide and so fragile would be useless, would melt and tear away in any of Earth's atmosphere but the outer fringes. He sees then, because he prefers to see it so, that it is the kid's model, or part of it, and for a toy, it does very well indeed. It is the part called Gamma, and it glides in, balancing, parallels the sand and holds away, slowing, then settles, all in slow motion, throwing up graceful sheet fountains of fine sand from its skids. And it runs along the ground for an impossible distance, letting down its weight by the ounce and stingily by the ounce until, until a skid, fits itself into a bridged crevasse. Look out! And still moving on, it settles down the struts. Gamma then, tired, digs her wide left wingtip carefully into the racing sands, digs it in hard. And as the wing breaks off, Gamma slews, sidles, slides slowly, pointing her other triangular tent-like wing at the sky, and broadside crushes into the rocks at the valley's end. As she rolls smashing over, there breaks from her broad back the sausage, the little Delta, which somersaults away to break its back upon the rocks, and through the broken hole spill smashed shards of graphite from the moderator of her power pile. Look out! Look out! And at the same instant from the finally checked mass of Gamma, there explodes a doll, which slides and tumbles into the sand, into the rocks, and smashed hot graphite from the wreck of Delta. The sick man numbly watches this toy destroy itself. What will they think of next? And with a gelid horror, prays at the doll lying in the raging rubble of the atomic pile. Don't stay there, man. Get away. Get away! That's hot, you know. But it seemed like a night, and a day, and half another night, before the doll staggers to its feet and, clumsy in its pressure suit, runs away up the valley side, climbs a sand-topped outcrop, slips, falls, lies under a slow cascade of cold, ancient sand until, but for an arm and the helmet, it is buried. The sun is high now, high enough to show the sea is not a sea, but brown plain with the frost burned off it. As now it burns away from the hills, diffusing in air and blurring the edges of the sun's disk, so that in a very few minutes there is no sun at all, but only a glare in the east. Then the valley below loses its shadows, and like an arrangement in a diorama, reveals the form and nature of the wreckage below. No tent city this, no installation, but the true, real ruin of Gamma and the eviscerated hulk of Delta. Alpha was the muscle, Beta the brain. Gamma was a bird, but Delta was the way home. And from it stretches the line of footprints, to and by the sick man, above to the bluff, and gone with the sand slide which had buried him there. Whose footprints? He knows whose, whether or not he knows that he knows, or wants to or not. He knows what satellite has, give or take a bit, a period like that. Wanted exactly, it's 7.66 hours. He knows what world has such a night, and such a frosty glare by day. He knows these things as he knows how spilled radioactives will pour the crash and mutter of surf into a man's earphones. Say you were that kid. Say instead, at last, that you are the sick man, for they are the same. Surely then you can understand why of all things, even while shattered, shocked, sick with radiation calculated, leaving, radiation computed, arriving, and radiation past all bearing, lying in the wreckage of Delta, you would want to think of the sea. For no farmer who fingers the soil with love and knowledge, no poet who sings of it, artist, contractor, engineer, even child bursting into tears at the inexpressible beauty of a field of daffodils, none of these is as intimate with earth as those who live on, live with, breathe, and drift in its seas. So, of these things, you must think. With these you must dwell until you are less sick and more ready to face the truth. The truth, then, is that the satellite fading here is Phobos, that those footprints are your own, that there is no sea here, that you have crashed and are killed and will in a moment be dead. The cold hand ready to squeeze and still your heart is not anoxia or even fear. It is death. Now, if there is something more important than this, now is the time for it to show itself. The sick man looks at the line of his own footprints, which testify that he is alone, and at the wreckage below, which states that there is no way back, and at the white east, and the mottled west, and the paling fleck-like satellite above. Surf sounds in his ears. He hears his pumps. He hears what is left of his breathing. The cold clamps down and folds him round past measuring, past all limit. Then he speaks, cries out. Then with joy he takes his triumph at the other side of death, as one takes a great fish, as one contemplates a skilled and mighty task, rebalances at the end of some great daring leap, and as he used to say, we shot a fish. He uses no eye. God, he cries, dying on Mars. God, we made it.
When I started doing these flashback episodes, we had a long conversation about their purpose and their remit. The purpose is to highlight some of the best episodes in EP's past. We've been around a while. There's a lot of them. And the remit is that nothing under 2 years should be eligible. That way we keep focused on the back catalogue and there's enough time to let the story bed in, get some context, and be pleasingly lost, so it's a nice surprise when we find it again. I was initially a little reluctant to do episode 500 because I thought, erroneously, that it was under the 2-year barrier. Turns out time really does fly when you're having fun. This episode was released 163 weeks ago. Then I was a little reluctant because, well, I believe part of my duty of care in this job is to make sure that I always face forwards on the rocket. While that should in no way be seen as a disservice to older stories, I've spent my professional career, a lot of the time, surrounded by panels about Tolkien minutiae, watching the battered shadow of Heinlein slip ever further to the right, and Lovecraft become the territory even more insidiously and often than he has the map. Facing backwards on the rocket is fine for some people. I am not one of them. And then I realised my reluctance was due to fear. I try and come at every piece of culture open-minded, open-eyed, open-hearted, and that last one can get tough. There are, as with everyone, certain things that will short-circuit my entire brain and mash the ugly cry buttons so hard the casing breaks. Doesn't matter how many times I read or watch them either, it works every single time. Here are some examples. The issue of global frequency with the alien language that is literally hacked by bisexuality. The closing montage of the first episode of The First, as work begins on the inquiry and Tom knowing full well that he will be going back to flight status and full well what that will cost him, goes for a run as Colin Stetson's extraordinary noise wall soundtrack swells beneath him. The unveiling of the Enterprise A. Both times. Every time. This story and those final agonized, triumphant lines. Looked at with contemporaneous eyes, this is massively impressive as a piece of work. Sturgeon balances hard science fiction and physics with actual character and emotion, memory with reality to create a story held forever in that moment before the burn begins to sting. When the blood is flowing but the nerves are, for now, silent. You don't need to see this man to know he has a buzz cut. You can see his silver suit, see the jaunty mission patch on his shoulder. This is Buzz Aldrin Radio Theatre. This is Gene Cernan's Lost Bell. The steely-eyed missile man, exultant that they made it, literally facing forwards on the rocket, looking not at the mistake that's cost him his life, but the mistake that has opened up an entire world to the people who were always going to follow him. Altruism with an oxygen supply. Selflessness at the end of self. Looked at with modern eyes, the story is, if anything, more triumphant, if slightly darker. One of my earliest memories is watching the Columbia launch for the first time. So is seeing the Challenger explode. I can still remember the exact details of the day Columbia came down, and where I was when I heard the commander thinks aloud for the first time, having no idea what it was, and the sobbing mess I was 3 minutes later. The link is in the show notes. Please consider yourself warned. There being something more to us, to our species and our history, feels like a revolutionary choice in 2019. Humanity's refusal to lose is too often also humanity's refusal to act. And I write this as the Davos summit of amateur Bond villains considers maybe possibly thinking about talking about environmental issues that, if they aren't addressed in 15 years, will maul the planet to an extent that will alter or end millions of lives. We only get one homeworld, and the security deposit is decades, perhaps centuries, past returnable on this one. Even closer to home, and the ongoing cobwebbed, burning pantomime of UK politics, there's a sense of so many things being aflame that even thinking past next week, let alone to the next planet, is ridiculous. And you know what? It is ridiculous. And that's the point. Hope is ridiculous. Hope is oxygen. To dream of something bigger when the world is a triage ward is to be something bigger in that world. To tell someone about it, to give them permission to hope, to dream, is to help them, to lift them out of the mire and start a bucket chain that finishes with us all watching the sunset on a new planet. Because innovation and drive is only ever the first stage. The second is organisation, and the third, the one that brings us home, wherever home is now, is kindness. To quote Catch-22, give everybody eat. To quote Shakespeare, what a brave new world that has such people in it. And to quote Captain Christopher Pike, wherever our mission takes us, we'll try to have a little fun along the way too, huh? Make a little noise, ruffle a few feathers. That's the final, glorious, ever so slightly postmodern sheen returning to this story has given it. Anson has done a ton of work for us, and it's all fantastic. His host spot over on Pseudopod especially is just spookily good. And now he is the face and voice of one of Starfleet's most iconic officers, and the biggest things his version of Pike bring to the table? Inclusion, fun, kindness. The first man on Mars, but never the last. The joy not just of arriving, but of knowing others will have an easier time of it because of your journey. The triumph of knowing you've helped. These are the things to boldly go towards. These are the reasons I love this story. We rely on you to pay our authors and cover our server costs and basically everything else. And there are 3 ways that you can do that. The one which is most well known is PayPal. It's really simple. You go to escapepod.org, click on the donate button, and donate or subscribe. For $5 or more, you'll get access to the premium content bucket. There's a bunch of really great stuff in there. Alternatively, you could go across to Patreon, and again, for $5, you get access to the premium content bucket, and there are really good rewards at the 10 and 20 level, including we're actually part of the new Patreon merchandise pilot program. And we've just shifted our goals over there as well. We are aiming to pay 8 cents a word as soon as we can possibly reach those goals. So if you want to not just help us, but help the authors that work with us get paid more for the work they do, that's where you go. But we're also very cognizant that not everyone can afford to assist financially, and that there are different forms of assistance to financial assistance. And with that in mind, could I suggest that if you like this episode, or any others, you tweet a link to it, or maybe write a blog post about it. Or if you have a podcast and you're looking for some guests, hi, we all love talking about this stuff, you might have been able to tell. Alternatively, or perhaps as well as, if you could leave a review on iTunes or Google, that would be fantastic. Or Spotify, we're all over there now, so there are lots and lots of ways to help boost the signal, whether it's putting fuel in the tank or talking about how cool the ship looks. We'll be back next week with The Wine Dark Feeling That Isn't the Blues by Jose Pablo Iriarte. Your host for that episode will be Mer, and your narration will come from Alethea Contis. Then, as now, we will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. We leave you this week with a quote from one Edwin Buzz Aldrin, who knows a little bit about this sort of thing. Exploration is wired into our brains. If we can see the horizon, we want to know what's beyond. Thanks, folks. We'll see you next week. Until then, have fun.